Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game tournament recap. This will be a 5-video series covering my attendance at CanCon 2023, which happened this past weekend. In this first video, we'll cover the lists that I took and also talk a little bit about what I didn't take, go into the first round, and then follow with a series of 4 videos covering rounds 2 through 5. For those who've seen the results, no spoilers, but I did do fairly well. I'm very happy with my performance this event. I took Tohaa. So on screen now is the list that I actually played all 5 rounds. Before we go into it though, I want to talk a little bit about why I picked Tohaa and what factions I didn't choose, because the mission selections for CanCon really made quite a lot of factions viable. The first thing when I was sort of like shortlisting down factions to take is I knew that I wanted to play a faction that I hadn't run really in an event or a big event in N4 so far. So that ruled out, for example, Hassassin Baram, which I took to WinterCon. It ruled out Combined Army, which I took to NovaCore. Both of those, incidentally, would have been very good factions for the mission selections with paramedic and hacker bonuses, sort of like across many scenarios. But I'm personally of the opinion, and I won't go into a long soapbox about this, but I think the game, if you have the option, the game is a lot better, kind of almost for everyone, if you rotate through lists and factions and try and constantly play different things. Not everyone can, obviously. Not everyone owns multiple armies or likes proxying or has proxy-friendly armies, and some people really aren't just dedicated enthusiast single-faction players. There are many people out there who are a pan-Oceanian player, and that's kind of it. But if you can, and if you feel like it's something that you can do, I think we all collectively benefit if we push the game away from a perceived solved state. If you have the one guy who every single event always plays the, for example, generic nomad list with puppets, tag, jazz, billy, etc., the game gets kind of stale for everyone. It becomes a known quantity, and it doesn't need to be that way. Infinity is really broad and really deep and really solution resistant, and when we play in a way that mixes things up, it's kind of just a better experience. So with that said, and that rant over, what was I thinking about and why did I pick Tohaa? So the eventual short list of factions came down to something like Yuqing, O12, Vanilla Hack-Islam, and Tohaa. I ended up deciding not to play O12 purely on the basis that the roadbot was not going to be in Army by the time CanCon rolled around, and if I could not play the roadbot, then I was not going to play O12. I think that's fairly reasonable, honestly, that the roadbot is a tremendous, like transformative piece for O12 and is fun as hell to use, but without it, they're still not quite there in terms of doing what it is that I want to do and what I enjoy. Yuqing, I've been enjoying Yuqing, but I did decide basically to eliminate them from contention for CanCon. The CanCon missions, which were acquisition, unmasking, supplies, supremacy, and cryogenics, had a not huge mission focus, but significant mission focus, particularly in some missions. And the way I play Yuqing, at least, is very much with an annihilation focus primarily, and kind of a scenario focus once the enemy is comprised mostly of corpses. Now, the Season 14 changes, or the most recent season changes, have helped Yuqing. Being able to put your forward observer remote in and kind of have a decent sort of like backup specialist is nice. Bishia is also like a prodigious specialist. She's a piece, basically the first piece in Yuqing that does everything I want and is a specialist. But it wasn't quite enough, and I wasn't confident in the annihilation approach to the CanCon missions to be really comfortable with the idea of playing Yuqing. So that left Tohaa and Hack-Islam. And obviously I selected Tohaa. So why didn't I pick Hack-Islam? I really like Hack-Islam. Actually, they're one of my favorite factions. I'm going to be going back to them big time now that CanCon is over. But when you play Hack-Islam, you are at the mercy of slightly more things than you are if you play Tohaa. So you're at the mercy of bad luck if your Fidei just kind of like whiffs or has to make an impersonation roll or can't get in. You're at the mercy of tables if you're banking primarily on 24-inch range bands. Sometimes you have to fight your way forward in order to get into Spitfire or Red Fury range. And if you're playing a Hack-Islam list that's built around those range bands and your opponent has MSV, that's just a Grenzer sitting on a tower a mile away, you can get not necessarily locked out of the game, but the failure states can accrue a little bit more quickly than I would like. I also really wasn't quite prepared to bank on every single deployment zone being really good, and if I'm running a bunch of bikes in Hack-Islam, then you run into that problem there. What if you can't sort of safely deploy your key pieces? I also kind of wanted to play a Magariba Guard, and that's the same problem. Not every table is going to be germane to the deployment of a Magariba. So I think Haqqislam are very strong, but I'm not. They were just very slightly edged out, given the prospect of playing a 5-round event. In a 5-round event, you're going to run into bad luck. You're going to run into bad tables. You're going to run into lucky opponents, and I had a few games with Tohaa early in the selection cycle, for want of a better word, that really reminded me how good Tohaa are. Not at having a high watermark of performance, like say Pan-Oceania does, but of having a performance floor that is so high that it can get you through those bad luck moments. And this list, which is on screen now, is built to play to that in the maximum possible way. So what have we got going on here, and why are these pieces in the list? This list has gone through about 8 different iterations before I settled on it. It is basically, to my mind, it was the best list that I could write that could do every single CanCon mission. And it was going to be paired with basically a back pocket list for some very specific scenarios / opponents / tables. I would end up playing this all 5 rounds. I'm very happy with it. It is kind of apex how I like to play Tohaa. So, the first group is our primary operational group. It is comprised of 9 linkable triad pieces and a motorized bounty hunter. The motorized bounty hunter would be perfectly serviceable in many different games. I never deployed it Impetuous, although I did in some testing games, but mostly it was a optional fast kind of warband attack piece if I needed it, and it would be very useful in some missions. In testing, I often found that if I didn't want to extend my larger triads, it would attack first and do some really good damage. For example, it's very good at doing stuff like punching through nomad defenses if it can just get past the crazy koalas, or sort of supporting. You can do a 1-2 punch with the motorized bounty hunter and the Liberto if you want to commit absolutely nothing and do some basic damage. But that wouldn't happen over the course of the event, but it was a useful capability. Tohaa irregulars, actually, just by the by, there are a really good selection of irregulars in Tohaa, but you kind of have to limit yourself to maybe about 3 of them, especially in the CanCon scenarios where 3 of the 5 would give you an extra irregular trooper. So, motorized bounty hunter, very useful piece. It's a disposable attack / backup element, and that's what I have to say about that. Otherwise, we have 9 linkable triad pieces with a degree of flexibility. Now, the order that they're laid out here is how I originally conceived of them, but it's not how they would usually deploy. So, in practice, what we would see is that the Sukhwhale and then both Kael'tars would typically deploy in a support triad. Note that Kael'tar Chain of Command has a combi rifle. It is 28 points, but I am paying for that because I want 3 symbiomates in the list. This is actually an Ed Sykes innovation. He began doing this in Spiral just to get 2 symbiomates, and I was sort of sufficiently impressed with the results that it's become a staple of my Tohaa lists. Symbiomates are really, really good, and you can usually afford 3 big guns in Tohaa if you want to. And having that 3rd symbiomate for the 3rd strong gun piece has consistently made so much difference. It's expensive. It costs you realistically 13 more points than if you just took a pleb Kael'tar, but it raises that performance floor of the army by a significant margin. So we have that little triad, the K1 sniper. To note, why the K1 sniper and not the missile launcher? Price. If I had 5 points to spare, I would probably pretty comfortably upgrade the K1 to the missile launcher, but the K1 is still very good, and it is so much cheaper that what I am afforded by taking the sniper instead is actually like a material 3rd, sort of 4th attack vector. Frankly, if I had 5 spare points, I would use it to upgrade the paramedic to a Sakiel before I upgraded the Sukhwhale to a missile launcher. So if I had 10 spare points, I would upgrade the K1 to a missile. The K1 almost always deploys on Overwatch, and it does the Tohaa Overwatch thing, where it watches a lane, ideally a very, very long one. It threatens things moving past it. It forces my opponent to move up a gun to engage it. Ideally, it then takes several orders before it loses a face-to-face roll. The symbiomate spangs a shot. Worst case scenario, I take 1 wound, then I drop prone. The goal is to preserve an attack element and especially an order generator, and waste 2 or 3 or X many orders of my opponents, killing symbiomates and nothing else. This is sort of how you build Tohaa ARO pieces, and is one of the reasons why I really wanted to play Tohaa, because a defensive mix that includes hard AROs is increasingly incredibly useful, at pinning back pieces that opponents have learned to use to punish null deployment. You can null deploy with Tohaa, but you also have the option of building these hard ARO elements, and that gives them a defensive versatility that would matter hugely across many games, and it was massive in testing. In terms of other triads, the 6 remaining pieces in this first combat group will usually form 2 triads, but they're a little bit flexible in terms of how they operate. The first triad is always going to have a Sukwale and a McCall, and the second is going to have a Sakiel and a McCall. That's a Sakiel viral combi EM grenade piece. But then you will mix up the Kamale paramedic and the tack wheel chain of command based on what you'll want each to do in any given scenario. Most commonly, it'll be Sukwale HMG, tack wheel chain of command McCall, and then Sakiel Kamale McCall as like a sort of cheap, disposable third triad in that list, but you can mix them up around. These sort of like last 3 pieces, the Sakiel, particularly the Sakiel and the Kamale paramedic, were the sort of like final decision I made in terms of the flex points in this list. Everything else was relatively locked in after sort of a few games of testing, with the occasional bounce up and down on the Sukwale to a missile launcher back to a K1. And finding what I would spend those last few points on took a fair bit of work. Options included things like a Greif operator, a Kirel preceptor, sometimes with 2 beasts. I declined to fit Jan in this list, but I was able to fit it in my second. We'll get to that in a bit. And even rationale boarding teams with things like shotguns and contenders were very, very good performers. But ultimately, the Sakiel viral combi is a huge value piece at 23 points for a viral weapon and 2 wounds, and it let me build out that third triad. And the inclusion of a Kamale paramedic would sometimes pay value, but more importantly, it gave me a very reliable specialist for supplies in particular, and to a lesser extent cryogenics. So we've got that first combat group that's comprised of three triads, each of which is capable of operations at different ranges. All of them can fight actually at a variety of ranges. All of them can be active if they need to. 2 of them, sometimes 3 of them, have their own smoke sources. All of them are useful elements. Then we get into combat group 2. So combat group 2 is comprised of pieces that kind of like are there for independent support and operations and like utility. So this is a piece that I use a lot, and I'm not sure how many other people do, the unlinked tack wheel lieutenant with +1 order. He is an absolute consistent all-star, and he's probably my favorite piece in Tohaa. And many, many turns begin with him spending those 2 lieutenant orders to move and conjure smoke through a wall that allows an opening that otherwise wouldn't have been able to be exploited. He also goes in after things and he endgames them. Basically, all of the stuff that tack wheel wants to do does not need to be in a link to do it. The only thing that he's not is a specialist, but in terms of being a support / back pocket offense piece, he's absolute par excellence. He's supported in this by Diplomatic Delegate, who we all know Diplomatic Delegate is very, very good. A Chaxa Auxiliary with Sensor. I would not usually use that to do anything particularly much. It's primarily a cheerleader, but sometimes you need a sensor, and it is one, and it's a decent corner guard. We then have a Libertos. Libertos are ubiquitous in my lists. I will always take one if I can. Sometimes I will cut the mine, but I would prefer not to. They're just great. They're just defensive. They hold things back. They attack. They win games by themselves sometimes, but most importantly, they help you not lose games, because a Libertos is a piece that can be thrown away to defend if you need to. It can pin back impersonators. It can do all sorts of stuff. It's super useful. Finally, and also sort of a star player, is the Nickel. The Nickel, the primary role of the Nickel, frankly, is table insurance. In practice, what it does is it gives you a reasonably big long-range gun in the second combat group that can walk around independently. It can take shots. It can sort of like, pick off flash pulse remotes, etc. It's useful. It's a good defensive piece. It is insurance against bears and wolves and etc. But the biggest thing it does, overwhelmingly, is mean that I can take advantage even of absolutely crap deployment zones with like blank rear 6 inches. I was hoping I would see really, really good tables at CanCon, and I certainly saw some absolutely beautiful ones. But any major in-person convention, like non-TTS games, you are always going to be somewhat at the mercy of your table setups. And the tournament organizers can't always police everything. And a Nickel just gives you an arrow piece that you can always deploy somewhere good. It doesn't matter how bad the table is. In fact, the worse the table is, often the better the Nikul is. You have wide open, ridiculously long fire lanes that are just frankly stupid and should never have been conceived of by the table deployer. Well, there goes the Nikul sitting on the back of the table edge watching everything. So that level of insurance is part of what I mean by Tohaa's performance flaw. Even in a really bad situation where like poor Hack Islam would have just been screwed by this like wasteland of a table, Tohaa have plays that they can make, and the Nikul was a major contributor to that. So this list, absolute performer, super recommended. It is just solid. It will just get you. It'll get you to where you need it to go. I've really enjoyed it. And yeah, the proof of the pudding as well is in the eating. It did very, very well for me. Really quickly, we'll talk about my second list. So this is list 2, which I never played. It is notable for the inclusion of Jan Star, who I'm aware is obviously a very, very meta piece in Tohaa. A couple of people have asked me, did I take Jan? And the answer is technically yes, but really no. I am not personally a Jan Star enjoyer. I think his target profile, his optimized, like ideal targets, are a very narrow series of profiles. He is basically only really, really good if you go first and you get into position and you reserve a second piece in order to give him a mate and a bomb, and you are going after a light link that is susceptible to eraser. So you can split the link, 4K arrows, place mines, deliver shotguns, etc. When Jan Star is playing into like a competent vanilla player, for example, he is far, far easier to triage. A Libertos can come down and pin him back, do a wound to him through the Symbiomate all the frickin' time, and then he just gets killed, killing 1 second piece. Jan Star is a very good piece, but he's not impossible to triage, and the better your opponent and the luckier your opponent, the worse he is. And given the modus operandi I kind of had for the event, I didn't really want to play pieces that were so swingy. He's also, frankly, a complete dead weight. He's 31 points your opponent can kill in a heartbeat if you are going second, and I did not trust myself to win lieutenant roles. So again, he's here, and this list exists for a very small number of circumstances because I was confident that I could play my first list, all the rest of the time. So what are the changes made to this list relative to the first one, and when would I use this list? So the second group is primarily similar to the previous list, except that I've had to cut the Chaxa and move the Motorized Bounty Hunter into this list. It does mean that it's very irregular heavy. You will spend a lot of command tokens making things happen, but it serves basically the same function. In the first group, there are a lot of similarities, except that we've cut an entire gun. Basically, the Sukhwhale HMG has come out, and in its place, we've got a Sukhwhale Forward Observer. We've also cut a tack wheel, so we're only running one tack wheel in this list in order to accommodate Jan Star. Otherwise, things are relatively similar. So what is this list accomplishing? Well, in testing, I was actually calling the list a specific toxin, and it was basically built for kind of like 3 players. Lockie Carter, Tom Bowl, and Gavin Bateman were all people who might be attending the event, and if they did attend the event, I expected to see Shock Army of the Contosamento and OSS, which is to say a lot of Armor Zero Link teams, things that Jan Star is actually pretty optimal against. Now, frankly, I'm not 100% convinced I would have dropped this list against them in any case, but it gave me a back pocket into those kind of matchups. And I also did expect to drop it if I ever played into like a corridor table. Any table that was very closed in, close, lots of rifle range bands, having the K1 combi rifle Sukhwhale rather than the sniper rifle would obviously pay dividends. So in practice, I think there were only maybe 2 or 3 tables across the 26 at CanCon that would have warranted this list, but I had it if I needed it. And that's sort of one of those advantages of having lists where both lists can feasibly play all scenarios. You can build your lists either for opponents or for tables to take sort of maximal advantage of that. So I never played Jan Star. He's kind of not for me. I had him if I needed him, and this list I think is fine. It's totally fine, and especially if you're a Jan enjoyer, this is quite good. I know that it's much more common to run Jan Star and 2 tack whales and the rest of this, but the sacrifices that you have to make to get that I really didn't like. In particular, giving up the 3rd Symbiomate. That's sort of the main sacrifice you have to make in order to fit all of those things into a list, into a meta Tohaa list. And the benefit, especially in a 5-round event where you're going to have to fight through some bad luck, of that 3rd Symbiomate kind of outweighed other considerations. That said, Never played this list, so there we go. So to actually talk about the first round of the game, first round of the event. First round was playing Acquisition, and I was playing against a US Ariadne player. Now, in basically all cases throughout these reports, I'm going to do my best to recreate my opponent's lists. I'm not 100% sure this is accurate, and I'm certainly not sure this is accurate with regards to combat groups, but it's approximately correct. The core of the list was the Grunt Fire Team. The sort of telegraphed Grunt Lieutenant Grenade Launcher is still quite useful, but 2 AP Snipers, Forward Observer, Paramedic. This list would serve as, this link would serve as a good quality, survivable, cheap fire team, kind of around which most US Ariadne lists are built. He then had a duo of a Maverick and a 112 motorized, couple of infiltration grunts, a Foxtrot, a fire team of a Marauder, a Minuteman, and Rosie. Now, I'm not actually sure if the AP Spitfire Marauder was in that link. He can afford it based on how I've recreated things, but I think he had maybe a boarding shotgun and mines Marauder, because he placed a mine with one of them. That kind of notwithstanding, I couldn't quite figure out where the rest of the points came from, if it wasn't the AP Spitfire, which fit perfectly, so not sure about that. He had a Dozer, presumably because it's a very good specialist in things like Acquisition, where you have an engineer bonus, and then Van Zant. The only things that are really missing from this list are aggressive warbands. Devil Dogs are probably the best dog warrior warbands, and I think you should probably usually put them in US Ariadne Ranger Force, although in this game on this table he's probably happier not to have done so because it was fairly open table and I had a nickel, which just kills dog warriors. So I like this as a list, and my opponent James, who I think is from Sydney, played it quite well. But make no mistake, this is a rough freaking matchup for US Ariadne. I think USARF is in a fairly good space balance-wise. They're interesting, they do some different things. They play that kind of like grunt line infantry play really nicely. But Tohaa just have so many tools. The existence of Ferroware alone into this entirely BTS-0 all wounds list just sucks. So this was absolutely hands down a horrible matchup for poor James to draw into in the first round, and he did his best playing into it. So this is the table that we're playing on, and by the by, it's gorgeous. I have some critiques of the tables in terms of their layout across CanCon. Not big ones, I think broadly, it was a very good event in terms of tables, but it did lean a little bit toward the more open tables. But they were gorgeous. They were just gorgeous almost across the board. Like 20 of the 26 tables were some of the biggest stunners I have ever seen. And this is one of them. This is from the Henry brothers. It's either Luke or Peters from Melbourne. And they bought it up and set it up. And it's just absolutely gorgeous. And I actually really enjoyed how it played. We have this big sort of like ship and shipping containers and these sort of like low channels of water, which as far as I know, no one played as actual water. But they give you this like broken ground kind of like elevation that you can just sort of like you can sneak up these corridors, up and around sort of the side of this ship, stuff like that. Gives you just sort of some options in terms of moving around, otherwise kind of an open table. You also have this high ground in the middle here that's sort of like, it's not easy to access, but there are some ladders. You've got to go like up a lot of ladders to get up here, but I would make good use of that. And a lot of vaultability as well. You see this on tables, actually across CanCon. One of the things we tried to make sure happened was lots of like vertical accessibility by going like hop, 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 hop up here. You can get a unit up onto those, sorry about that, unit up onto those crates sort of like in short order. So gorgeous looking table on the open side, but that is why I was playing Tohaa. So my opponent wins the lieutenant role. I would win 1 lieutenant role out of 5 over the course of the 2 days. And this being Acquisition, he picks to deploy second on this side. Now, this is a scenario where I'm not 100% sure you actually want to necessarily do that. Acquisition, and I've spoken about this before, Acquisition is all end of game scoring, which yes, means that the second player can kind of just like rush onto the objectives. But it means that the first player, apart from having to press 2 buttons at some point during the game and do that classified, has 3 turns to put you down and out to secure uncontested dominance of the objectives themselves. And if you're playing against Tohaa, who can do that to US Ariadne, it's rough, it's risky. Now, would things have been better for him if he had gone first? Frankly, not necessarily. He has the guns to dislodge my ARO pieces if he gets sort of like even just a little bit lucky, but not to do that and push forward, and the counter assault is going to be rough. And the Tohaa performance flaw rears its head again in scenarios like acquisition, where even if you kick the absolute crap out of Tohaa for 3 turns in a row, they're almost always going to end up with some elements left, and those elements will often have Eclipse Smoke, which means that they can do a last turn bum rush onto these objectives, and you kind of can't stop them. So I don't begrudge my opponent his choice for going second effectively, but ultimately it would be fairly punishing. So I'm deploying on this side. We have the nickel providing table insurance once again here, being up on this position. Now, would I put a regular sniper there? I might put it down on this crate behind it, but the nickel had a lot of lines of fire here and was not going to be exposed to plunging fire from this rooftop. If it did get engaged from there, it was still going to have cover thanks to the foxhole. This is what nickels do. The short-range attack team with the Sakiel, the paramedic, and McCall is hanging out down here, as is the tack wheel officer. There's space to move through this boat, and I kind of just hoped that he would move up to here and maybe kill something, and it turns out that he would. Motorized bounty hunter is here, not deployed impetuously. It rolls up a HMG, but will never use it. And the delegate is here, ready to move up onto this objective. On the other side of the table, we've got the sniper link team over here. Again, there's some long lanes of fire, kind of like in that space. And then pride of place, 16-inch deployment zones, I'm able to actually deploy onto this race platform here with the tack wheel, sook wheel, McCall team. And the McCall is down on ground level, but the sook whale is going to very quickly move up to this ladder and up onto the high ground. For my opponent's part, he's got his grunt link team hanging out around here in this space. His 2 bikes are hanging out back here, and then he has like a smattering of sort of like midfield elements. The infiltration grunts are all just kind of deployed in places where they can be moderately safe. The Foxtrot's hanging out here, and then Rosie's team is back here. So, word of caution for subsequent videos, this is like the only game, like one of maybe 2 that I actually remember to take photos for, because it was an intense 5-day event. But you can see some kind of shots of what's going on here. We can see the Kael'ta paramedic is hanging out down there. We can see sort of some of what the Nakul can see here, right? So it's got this lane and then this lane on heavy lockdown, and there are not a lot of pieces that my opponent is going to want to move up to contest. Similarly, here we can see what the K1 sniper can see. She can look over this crate, and she's got a nice line down kind of like into these alleys here, and then also to contest the grunt link. My opponent has deployed the grunt link fairly well here, where only one of the 2 grunts can see the sook whale. So if she chooses to, both grunts rather can see the sook whale. The other one is sort of like hanging out here, which means that if she chooses to engage them, they'll have burst 4 coming back at her. Here's a closer shot of the rooftop that the sook whale is going to move up onto in short order. My opponent is still deploying here, so please ignore these troops back there. And then here's sort of a better shot of how my opponent's link team is deployed. So we can see so Rosie's team is hanging out back here. The grunt snipers are positioned like this, both of them pinning back the sook whale K1 in that direction. The obvious grunt lieutenant is there, but I'm never going to quite be able to get to it. And then we've got sort of paramedic and forward observer. This positioning actually, I think, showcases probably one of the biggest mistakes my opponent made, and it was the deployment of this grunt sniper here. He could have deployed it in this position there, and as long as this grunt is prone, they're still both going to be safe from like missile templates to hit either of them, for example, but it would have put him in cover against the firestorm that was going to come. It would still have seen the K1 Sukhoi. He got slightly better lines of fire here, but this would ultimately undo this grunt. So I win the roll. Sorry, I might lose the roll, but my opponent is going second, I'm going first, and we immediately see, basically, the first turn, we immediately see a demonstrator of what I was talking about before with the Tohaa bad luck resistance, because the very first thing that happens is that I move the sook whale up onto this rooftop, and I'm able to just move it around first to see the grunt sniper that is back here, and it crits me. Now I'm rolling 5 dice on 16s, he's rolling 2 dice on 11s. He rolls that 11, it's okay. I roll a 16, crits cancel, that's okay. I activate again, I shoot him again, and he crits me again. And I don't crit him, so I take 2 saves. Now, that is a damage 16 armor piercing shock round, which would absolutely do for a piece like, say, Nauf, or like a random HMG. You could have put an Azrael up on that rooftop, and it would probably have gone down to that. A tag would be in trouble and not loving life. But the symbiote jumps in the way. Armor 9, total immunity, spang the hits. and I'm able to spool up for a third time, put 5 more rounds downrange, and actually finally end that grunt. Now, basically, there are other factions that could have taken that fight and won that fight in the same way that I did, maybe at increased casualties, maybe with a bigger and more expensive piece. But that's the way that you want to do it with Tohaa, and you have that. You can have a catastrophic failure state emerge once for any individual piece a lot of the time, and it's fine. And that resilience to absolutely crap luck, getting crit twice in ARO in the first 2 face-to-face rolls, that's a Tohaa thing, and that is one of the reasons why I wanted to play Tohaa for this event. Now, in terms of the rest of the turn, the Sick Whale basically will go brute from this rooftop for most of the rest of the turn. She'll put down this grunt, and actually, hang on a second, no. She'll put down just the grunt sniper that she fights, and then she'll put some shots into the grunts that are hanging out back here, but they will crit their dodges and get back into safety. The tack wheel officer will move up into this, basically into this interior area here, and Fairware the grunt infiltrator to death. And then the Libertos will make a run around here. The Sook Whale puts down this grunt, just basically like slicing lines of fire, moving around in this space here. And then the grunt makes a suicide run, and we get a hold, discover, split the shotgun templates, put down the sniper, don't put down the forward observer, but basically I make a bit of a mess of my opponent. By the end of this first turn, I've downed quite a lot of pieces. I haven't pressed any buttons, although the delegate is kind of moving forward. But the important thing is that I've damaged a lot of my opponent's ability to actually punch me back. I've put down, I think, 3 or 4 models by the end of the turn, and I have big guns kind of watching everything. A notable decision that I've made, because I can tell that there are 14 troopers on the board, is that the Sook Whale, after doing all of its work, comes back down here and stands basically at this doorway, watching my deployment zone, because I am concerned that something might come onto my deployment zone. And this caution, which will last through the first 2 turns, is going to end up mattering sort of like a fair bit. My opponent rejoinders as best that he can, but his ability to counterpunch is really limited. The infiltration grunts that he might use to like punch me back in a cost-effective way, threaten those flamethrowers, they're down for the count. So what he does is he moves his biker team forward. And really he just tries to spend the turn recovering using paramedics. The bikes can get forward because this big set of crates is in the way of the nickel. And so they move up and they actually successfully paramedic this grunt, and then they kind of pull back into position here where they'll be safe. So that recovers 1 trooper, and then the paramedic back here runs around and tries to recover some other things, but basically doesn't succeed. I think he's able to get back maybe the forward observer, but the snipers are down and out. The one attempt to get the sniper back doesn't succeed, and that's sort of kind of that. He has some orders left, and so the AP HMG comes around to see, but the nickel puts it in the dirt. This is more than 32 inches, and so he's rolling on 4s, I think, to my 12s. Takes a couple of goes. Inconclusive first face-to-face roll, loses the second. And this is basically how this game will play out. At this point, I have the situation very much on lock. I can keep taking gunfights. That the grunt that he recovered, I can just kill again with my lieutenant using those 2 lieutenant orders. Again, it's free real estate. And so I spend the bulk of my second turn just moving up, pressing buttons, securing the position. I just discover and kill the forward observer Foxtrot. And then my motorized bounty hunter zooms around here and engages his 2 bikes, who, faced with the combination of either the chain colts or the submachine gun, basically just have to elect to shoot and hope to get lucky, and the chain colts kill them both. So going into his second round, my opponent really is not in retreat, but he's got very little left, he's running out of puff, and he brings on Van Zant kind of just as a last ditch, maybe this will save the game. So Van Zant moves up here. I've tried to pin him back, but he's able to find a space that's sort of like safe from my overwatch. He gats the Nicole a couple of times with a pistol, consumes the Symbiomate and does a wound. And so I just guts prone onto this rooftop. That's fine. I want the Nicole to keep generating orders and being worth points. And then from there, Van Zant kind of just like runs around a little bit. This K1 sniper still has like a nice long lane across there. So he's not going to be able to, even though he's making really good use of these like watery alleyways to move around, he's not going to be able to push up and over and do a huge amount of damage. My diplomatic delegate, who's moved up to this objective by this point, gets shot in the back and knocked unconscious, but it's kind of like not enough. It's too little, too late, and these are all recoverable losses. In my last turn, going first, I will paramedic the delegate back up. My lieutenant will walk back here and put Jan Star down with Van Zant down with Ferroware, and I'll basically end my turn expecting my opponent to be in retreat, standing on basically all three buttons with all three buttons pressed. The Sakiel team has moved forward and is occupying this space. The Sukhwel HMG and the snipers are still on Overwatch. Multiple bodies are surrounding each objective, and I pass turn to my opponent. He's kind of got nothing left. So that's, from my perspective, a very good start to the day. This matchup was basically ideal. Two TAC wheel officers versus US Ariadne. Even a well-piloted US Ariadne list, that's a really hard fight. And the fact that I was going first and able to put down his snipers and give myself free reign of the board basically meant I got to play despite some early bad luck, I pushed through that and was able to play my game the entire time. So this was, I think, a 10-0 or 10-1 win my way. And a strong start to my opponent, who bore up very well against a really, really rough matchup. So that's the end of this battle report. There are 4 more to come. Stay tuned for the next one.